The dense, mountainous terrain of the territory of Papua in 1942 was not merely a passive background for military operations, it was a hostile, active participant in the war, a landscape so brutal that it rendered conventional military doctrine nearly irrelevant. This was the Green Hell, a vast expanse of torrential rainforest, razor-sharp ridges, and malaria-ridden swamps that presented an insurmountable logistical barrier. Yet, it was precisely through this geographic nightmare that the Japanese Imperial High Command planned their audacious, high-risk offensive to seize Port Moresby, the key Australian base on the southern coast of New Guinea. The seizure of Port Moresby was the final non-negotiable step required to isolate Australia from its American allies, securing the entire southern flank of Japan's new Pacific Empire. The Japanese strategy, rooted in a fundamental miscalculation of geography and logistics, relied on the assumption that the terrain itself would be their greatest protector. They believed that the primary route across the Owen Stanley Range, the narrow, treacherous Kokoda Trail, was an impossible line of supply for the Allied forces, and therefore a defensible, manageable route for their own fast-moving, lightly equipped infantry. Their goal was a rapid overland thrust, bypassing the need for a sustained, vulnerable naval supply line through the Coral Sea, an area already under dispute with the Allied navies. The entire campaign was predicated on speed, individual endurance, and the capacity of the jungle to neutralize the overwhelming material superiority of the Allied forces. This strategic certainty, however, was quickly and brutally shattered by the grim reality of the Papuan interior. The environment of the Kokoda Trail was a relentless, multi-layered enemy. The trail itself was a narrow, muddy track, twisting over peaks that reached 7,000 feet, often disappearing into thick fog or plunging into deep ravines. The heat and humidity were suffocating, followed by torrential downpours that turned the steep slopes into slick, impassable waterfalls of mud. This terrain forced the entire campaign to rely on human portage, the carrying of all supplies, ammunition, and medical aid by local New Guinean laborers, known as the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels. For both the Australian and Japanese forces, the logistical chain was reduced to the strength of a man's back, a profound vulnerability that instantly capped the operational capacity of both armies. The Japanese assault, launched from the northern beachheads near Buna and Gona, achieved initial, terrifying success. Their elite South Seas detachment, hardened by experience in China, moved with astonishing speed and discipline, quickly overwhelming the initial, sparse Australian defenses and seizing the crucial village of Kokoda, the psychological and physical pivot point of the trail. The Australian defense, initially reliant on militia battalions, the Maroubra Force, composed of younger, less experienced troops, was forced into a desperate, continuous retreat, fighting a series of brutal rearguard actions across the mountains. The Japanese forces believed the jungle was their shield, but as the campaign stretched on, the jungle's active hostility, disease, starvation, and the sheer impossibility of resupply began to turn their advance into a logistical coffin. The Australians, fighting backward toward their base, were slowly learning how to survive the environment. The Japanese, driven by the need for speed, were fatally consuming their reserves against the terrain itself. The strategic failure of the Japanese in the Kokoda Campaign can be defined by their catastrophic inability to solve the logistical logic of the trap. The realization that the jungle, once it slowed their advance, turned from a protector into an inescapable executioner. The Australians, fighting backward toward their own supply base, faced immense logistical problems, but the Japanese forces, operating at the end of a chain stretching across the ocean and over the highest peaks, faced absolute logistical denial. The most corrosive, silent enemy faced by the Japanese was disease and starvation. The Papuan interior was a petri dish of tropical illnesses: malaria, typhus, dysentery, and scrub typhus, diseases that ravaged the Japanese ranks far more effectively than Australian bullets. The lack of proper medical supplies, coupled with the systemic failure to adequately feed the troops, led to a rapid, profound deterioration of the Japanese fighting strength. Units that were not directly engaged in combat were often decimated by illness and exhaustion, reducing their effective operational strength by half. The Imperial Command had planned for a rapid 2-week dash. They were trapped in a 2-month war of attrition, where the tropical pathogens were a continuous, unassailable enemy. The logistical supply chain, dependent entirely on the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels and the few Japanese porters, collapsed rapidly under the sheer weight of the distance and the terrain. Ammunition, medical aid, and even basic rations simply could not be transported across the treacherous, constantly moving line. Japanese soldiers, already operating on severely reduced rations, were forced to subsist on what they could carry or forage, leading to acute, pervasive starvation. Accounts from the fighting describe Japanese soldiers engaging in combat while suffering from severe malnutrition, their bodies wasted by dysentery and malaria. This physical collapse robbed the Japanese offensive of its essential energy, ensuring that their tactical skill and discipline were gradually negated by simple biological necessity. The Australians, conversely, were slowly, painfully building a sustainable logistical network. Though facing immense difficulties, their supply line benefited from the existence of the secure Port Moresby base and the gradual increase in air transport capability, dropping critical supplies by parachute into clearing points along the trail. The ability of the Australian command to utilize advanced medical evacuation methods, including flying out the severely wounded, ensured that their forces maintained a higher effective fighting strength than their Japanese counterparts. The difference between the two forces was stark. The Australians were fighting to gain time for their supply line to stabilize. The Japanese were fighting against a supply line that was actively consuming them. The final critical turning point was the denial of the Japanese naval link. Allied forces successfully prevented the reinforcement and resupply of the Japanese northern beachheads by sea, leaving the attacking forces completely dependent on the collapsing overland trail. This strategic victory sealed the logistical trap. The Japanese forces, believing the jungle was their fortress, were instead isolated, starved, and systematically consumed by the environment they had so fatally miscalculated. Attention, jungle fighters. You've just walked the Kokoda Trail, where the enemy was disease and starvation, not just bullets. This campaign was won by logistics and endurance, not firepower. If the brutal reality of the Green Hell resonates with your understanding of the war's non-conventional theaters, then don't let the supply line break. Subscribe now and commit to analyzing the campaigns where the terrain was the ultimate weapon. And we need your tactical assessment. What single resource deficiency, medical supplies, ammunition, or food, do you believe was the most fatal flaw in the Japanese advance? Drop your intelligence report in the comments below. Let the world hear the sound of the ultimate attrition. The entire logistical framework of the Kokoda Campaign and the ultimate survival of the Australian forces was fundamentally dependent on the extraordinary contribution of the local Papuan people, the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels. These native carriers, drawn from villages along and around the Kokoda Trail, formed the human engine that kept the Allied war effort alive, fulfilling a logistical role that no mechanical means could possibly replicate in the jungle environment. Their story is one of immense courage, profound selflessness, and the absolute necessity of local knowledge in determining the fate of a global conflict. The logistical demand was immense. Every shell, every bandage, and every ration of food had to be carried by hand, up and down the razor-sharp, slippery slopes of the Owen Stanley Range. The Papuan carriers performed this grueling work with unparalleled endurance and an intimate, lifelong knowledge of the jungle terrain that allowed them to navigate the treacherous paths with efficiency and speed the foreign troops could only marvel at. They moved not just the supplies needed for the advance, but crucially, they moved the wounded and the sick, carrying the injured Australian soldiers back from the front line on makeshift stretchers, often across vast distances and over terrifying peaks, ensuring that the injured received essential medical care rather than being abandoned to the jungle. The contribution of the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels was not merely one of labor. It was a profound moral and humanitarian force. The carriers often went without food themselves, giving their meager rations to the wounded soldiers they were evacuating. Their care for the injured, their gentle demeanor, and their stoic resilience under immense physical duress earned them the enduring respect and affection of the Australian troops. This human bond, forged in the brutal crucible of the Papuan jungle, transcended the immediate conflict and became a powerful symbol of collaboration and mutual dependency. The affectionate nickname, Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, was a testament to the profound impact of their compassionate service. The Japanese forces, conversely, failed to effectively utilize or sustain a similar robust local support network. Their interactions with the local population were often characterized by brutality and requisition, a colonial approach that alienated the Papuans and denied the Japanese the critical local intelligence and logistical support that proved so vital to the Australian effort. This cultural and operational failure was a significant contributing factor to the collapse of the Japanese supply line and their subsequent isolation in the interior. The Papuans chose their allegiance, and that choice provided the Australians with the essential human logistical edge. The legacy of the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels is a powerful testament to the fact that modern war, even in its most mechanized form, often reverts to the most basic logistical reliance on human strength and local knowledge. Their service ensured that the Australian forces could maintain the necessary operational tempo and casualty management required to survive the initial Japanese thrust and eventually launch the decisive counterattack. The success of the Australian defense was fundamentally built upon the strength, courage, and immense sacrifice of the Papuan people, the silent human engine that kept the Allied cause alive in the Green Hell. The entire Kokoda Campaign was a catastrophic outcome of strategic underestimation by the Japanese Imperial High Command in Tokyo. Their fatal flaw was not military tactics, but a profound misreading of the logistical, environmental, and enemy commitment required to seize the objective. Tokyo saw the operation as a swift, low-cost thrust, designed to exploit the assumed weakness of the Australian defenses and the perceived invincibility of their own elite jungle troops. The primary strategic error was the assumption of logistical short-termism. The High Command failed to plan for a sustained campaign, believing that speed would negate the need for a robust supply chain. They committed forces with minimal reserve capacity, assuming that once Port Moresby was seized, it could be supplied by sea. This high-risk strategy, which worked effectively in the short, island-hopping campaigns of the earlier war, proved disastrous when faced with the immense scale and geographical obstacles of New Guinea. The vast distance from the northern beachheads to Port Moresby was simply too great for human portage to sustain, a logistical reality that should have been recognized at the highest levels of planning. The second fatal flaw was the underestimation of the Australian commitment and resilience. Tokyo had assumed that the Australian defense would quickly collapse, either due to the inexperience of the militia units or the sheer shock of the Japanese jungle tactics. They failed to account for the strategic necessity that defined the Australian defense. New Guinea was the final non-negotiable line of defense for the Australian mainland. The Australian command, backed by General Douglas MacArthur, viewed the campaign as an existential battle, ensuring that despite the initial setbacks and the use of green troops, massive resources, experienced veteran units, like the 7th Division, and relentless political will were committed to the fight. The Japanese, expecting a light defense, encountered an enemy fighting for survival with an unyielding determination. Furthermore, the Japanese command failed to correctly gauge the impact of Allied air superiority and naval power. Their reliance on the overland route was a concession to the fear of Allied sea power following the Battle of the Coral Sea. Yet they failed to account for the disruptive power of Allied airdrops along the trail. The constant threat of Allied aircraft forced the Japanese to abandon large-scale movement and further crippled any desperate attempts to resupply the northern beachheads by small, fast surface vessels. The Japanese forces were thus isolated not just by the mountains, but by the comprehensive air and naval dominance that the Allies were rapidly establishing in the region. The eventual Japanese decision to order a strategic retreat from the heights of the Owen Stanley Range was a direct consequence of the logistical and strategic failure. They had advanced to the point of utter exhaustion, their offensive capacity shattered not by a singular military defeat, but by the collective systemic failure of supply, illness, and the unyielding environment. The strategic underestimation in Tokyo translated directly into the physical suffering and ultimate defeat of their elite troops on the Kokoda Trail, confirming that the war in the Pacific was fundamentally a logistical contest dictated by industrial capacity and command foresight. The relentless, agonizing Australian retreat along the Kokoda Trail finally reached its terminal point at Imita Ridge, a strategic position located just 30 miles from Port Moresby. This ridge was the last viable defensive line before the coastal plains, and the Australian defense of Imita was viewed by the Allied command as the absolute non-negotiable climax of the entire campaign. The successful defense of Imita Ridge not only halted the Japanese advance, but marked the definitive, irreversible turning point where the strategic initiative shifted entirely to the Australian forces. The emotional and physical tension at Imita Ridge was immense. The Australian forces, augmented by the arrival of the veteran 25th Brigade of the 7th Division, were pushed to their final physical limits. The troops had been retreating and fighting continuously for weeks, suffering high casualties and battling debilitating illnesses. The realization that failure at Imita meant the immediate loss of Port Moresby and the subsequent isolation of Australia focused the minds of the entire Allied command. The line was held by a combination of desperate entrenchment, massive logistical reinforcement, including parachute drops, and the sheer unyielding will of the Australian infantry. The Japanese attack on the Imita Ridge defenses was significantly weakened by the factors we have discussed: starvation, disease, and logistical collapse. The advancing Japanese units were shadows of their former selves, often operating on minimal ammunition and physically unable to sustain the intense, prolonged fighting required to breach the prepared Australian defenses. The sheer difficulty of supplying the attacking force over the extended collapsed trail meant that the Japanese offensive had peaked and was functionally unsustainable. The Imperial Command, recognizing the immense cost and the logistical impossibility of reinforcing the forward elements, was forced to make the agonizing decision to halt the advance. The Australian defense held firm, and the Japanese command issued the strategic order for a general, definitive retreat back across the Owen Stanley Range toward their northern beachheads. This was not a tactical withdrawal. It was an acknowledgement of absolute strategic defeat. The Japanese forces, having consumed their entire operational reserve and human endurance against the environment and the supply line, were forced to cede the strategic ground and attempt a desperate, high-cost defensive retreat to hold their tenuous coastal positions. The cost of this defense was immense for the Japanese. The retreat, fought backward across the same collapsed supply lines, was even more devastating than the initial advance, with thousands perishing from starvation and disease. The victory at Imita Ridge secured the Australian logistical base and provided the necessary operational platform for the immediate launch of the decisive counteroffensive. The Australian forces, now augmented by fresh troops and supported by a stabilizing supply chain, began the long, agonizing advance back up the Kokoda Trail, pursuing a weakened, demoralized, and starving enemy. The symbolic significance of the turning point was absolute. The jungle, once the Japanese protector, had become their prison, and the Australians had finally seized the strategic initiative through sheer endurance and logistics. You've witnessed the complete strategic turnaround at Imita Ridge, the moment courage and logistics defeated starvation and miscalculation. The tide has turned. If the grim reality of the jungle war and the pivotal nature of this victory resonate with your strategic mind, we need your eyes on the counteroffensive. Subscribe now and solidify your commitment to understanding the true mechanics of Pacific warfare. And we need your final intelligence task. Suggest the next great Allied counteroffensive of WI2X2, perhaps the drive through Italy or the liberation of the Philippines, for our deep dive analysis. Your suggestions guide our strategic mission. The strategic order for the Japanese retreat initiated the final grinding phase of the Kokoda Campaign. The Australian counteroffensive back up the treacherous trail. This advance was not a glorious sprint. It was a slow, agonizing process of systematic clearance, fought across the same brutal terrain that had consumed the energy of the initial Japanese push. For the Australian forces, the logistical challenges were immense, now compounded by the necessity of pursuing a skilled enemy, fighting a desperate rearguard action to buy time for the coastal defense. The primary challenge for the Australian forces was a critical issue of speed and supply. While the Japanese forces were starving and weakened, they maintained immense tactical skill and discipline, utilizing the jungle environment to their advantage. They established brutal defensive strongpoints on the reverse slopes of the mountains, forcing the Australian infantry to engage in costly uphill frontal assaults. The terrain, now saturated by the continuous monsoon rains, remained an active enemy, ensuring that the rate of advance was agonizingly slow, and the logistical chain was perpetually stretched. The constant need for resupply, ammunition, and medical support over the immense distances remained the limiting factor on the speed of the counteroffensive. The Australian command, having learned the bitter lessons of the Japanese failure, prioritized the stability of the supply chain above all else. The use of the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels intensified, and the air supply drops became more frequent and meticulously planned, ensuring that the advancing troops received continuous support. This dedication to logistics, coupled with the systematic rotation of depleted units with fresh reserves, maintained the operational capacity of the Australian forces and guaranteed that the momentum of the pursuit was never lost. The logistical framework became the ultimate weapon, ensuring that the Australian forces could fight sustained battles while the Japanese forces were starving. The Japanese retreat was a desperate attempt to consolidate their forces around the northern beachheads of Buna and Gona, the original launch point of their offensive. The units were ordered to fight to the last man to delay the Australian advance, allowing the core of their surviving forces to prepare a final, fortified defense of the coastal strip. This withdrawal was characterized by immense brutality and immense loss of life on the Japanese side, with vast numbers of men succumbing to starvation and disease before they ever reached the relative safety of the coast. The retreat was a confirmation that the logistical weakness of the Japanese forces was not a temporary setback, but a fatal, systemic flaw. The Australian counteroffensive, fueled by superior logistics and sustained resolve, systematically dismantled the Japanese rearguard, pushing them back across the key geographical features of the Owen Stanley Range. The cost remained high for the Australians, but the relentless pressure ensured that the Japanese forces were denied the time necessary to establish a fully cohesive, impregnable defense of the coastal areas. The Green Hell, having defeated the offensive, was now systematically consuming the retreat, paving the way for the decisive final battles on the coastal plain. The final act of the Kokoda Campaign was fought on the narrow, swampy coastal plain surrounding the villages of Buna and Gona. Having failed to seize Port Moresby by an overland thrust, the Japanese forces consolidated their depleted strength into a desperate, highly fortified final defense of their beachheads, the very positions they had used to launch their initial, confident offensive. This coastal fortress, built from a massive network of reinforced bunkers, trenches, and hidden strongpoints, was designed to resist a protracted siege and inflict maximum casualties on the attacking Allied forces. The battle for Buna and Gona was a profound, brutal contrast to the mountain fighting. The terrain was flat, low-lying, and intensely swampy, marked by thick mangrove forests and shallow beaches, a landscape that favored the deeply entrenched defender and completely negated the mobility of Allied armor. The Japanese had constructed their defenses using coconut log bunkers, massive, thick walls of hardened wood and sand that were nearly impervious to all but direct, heavy artillery fire. These fortifications were interconnected, providing overlapping fields of fire that turned the coastal strip into a dense, almost impenetrable defensive system. The Allied attack, led by the veteran Australian 7th Division and newly committed American infantry, quickly devolved into a slow, high-cost frontal assault against these fixed positions. The sheer strength of the coconut log bunkers and the fanatical, disciplined resistance of the Japanese defenders meant that every meter of advance was purchased with immense loss of life. The fighting was characterized by brutal, close-quarters combat, often requiring the use of flamethrowers, grenades, and satchel charges to breach the bunkers one by one. The dense jungle and swampy terrain made coordinated movement and fire support extremely difficult, forcing the infantry to bear the brunt of the continuous, intense resistance. The logistical issues remained critical, now shifting from the problem of distance to the problem of evacuation and heavy support. While supplies could be landed on the beaches, the swampy terrain made the movement of heavy artillery and tanks to the front lines extremely difficult, often requiring the construction of massive wooden corduroy roads. The tropical diseases, particularly malaria and dysentery, continued to ravage the Allied forces, ensuring that the sick and wounded required constant evacuation, stretching the medical infrastructure to its limits. The sheer, tenacious Japanese defense of Buna and Gona was rooted in the knowledge that they were fighting to the last man. The Imperial Command had issued strict orders of no retreat and no surrender, turning the final siege into a brutal war of extermination. The Allied forces were forced to systematically reduce the bunkers, facing fierce resistance from Japanese soldiers who often fought until they were literally buried alive. The battle for Buna and Gona was a grim, final demonstration of the brutal cost required to defeat a disciplined, entrenched enemy in a hostile environment, bringing the entire Kokoda Campaign to its final, devastating climax. The final success of the Allied forces in clearing the Buna-Gona coastal strip was fundamentally secured by a decisive logistical turning point: the sustained, systematic application of Allied air superiority to solve the seemingly impossible problems of supply and evacuation. The battle for the coastal fortress was ultimately won by the steady, unyielding capacity of the Allied Air Force to maintain the lifeline for the troops engaged in the brutal siege. The primary logistical obstacle was the inability to move heavy materiel over the vast, treacherous distances of the interior. The Allied Air Force solved this problem by establishing a comprehensive network of air supply drops and short-distance transport, utilizing small, rugged airstrips carved out of the jungle. This sustained air bridge bypassed the limitations of the ground supply line and ensured that the infantry and engineers received the heavy equipment they desperately needed, including artillery pieces, medical supplies, and engineering materials, at a scale that the Japanese could not counter. This air superiority was the ultimate weapon against the entrenched coconut log bunkers, guaranteeing that the Allied forces always possessed the necessary firepower for the final breach. The second critical role of air power was medical evacuation. The high rate of combat casualties and the devastating spread of tropical diseases meant that the survival of the Allied troops relied entirely on their ability to rapidly evacuate the wounded and the sick. The small, quick-landing transport aircraft, flying perilous sorties into the small jungle airstrips, pulled out thousands of men, transporting them to the massive, advanced medical facilities at Port Moresby and Australia. This ability to evacuate casualties rapidly and efficiently, a capability the Japanese entirely lacked, maintained the morale of the Allied troops and ensured that the effective fighting strength of the units was preserved. The Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels brought the wounded to the airstrips, and the Allied air transport completed the journey to safety. The sustained application of Allied air superiority was also decisive in neutralizing Japanese resistance. Constant bombing and strafing runs suppressed the Japanese coastal strongpoints and disrupted any last-ditch attempts to resupply the besieged forces by sea. The Allied air dominance turned the sky from a neutral zone into an active, lethal shield for the attacking forces, guaranteeing that the Japanese forces were isolated and relentlessly pressured from above and below. The entire battle for the coastal beachheads, therefore, was a profound demonstration of the supremacy of the logistical system. The courage of the Australian and American infantry in breaching the coconut log bunkers was immense, but their success was guaranteed by the unwavering, relentless supply of ammunition, firepower, and fresh troops delivered by the comprehensive Allied air transport network. The technological and logistical capacity of the Allied forces proved to be the ultimate deciding factor that systematically destroyed the entrenched, isolated Japanese defense. The ultimate defeat of the Japanese forces at Buna and Gona delivered a stark, brutal anatomy of strategic attrition, a final chilling account of how logistical failure, environmental hostility, and command delusion systematically consumed an elite fighting force. The Kokoda Campaign, more than any other battle in the Pacific, confirmed the decisive role of material and supply in the total defeat of the Japanese Imperial Army. The strategic cost of the campaign for the Japanese was catastrophic. The offensive consumed over 13,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing, the vast majority of whom perished not from direct combat, but from disease and starvation. This immense, irreplaceable loss of elite manpower and combat expertise crippled the Japanese offensive capacity in the crucial Southern Pacific theater. The Imperial High Command's high-risk gamble on a swift overland thrust failed, consuming the entire elite South Seas detachment and ensuring that future operations would be severely hampered by the lack of seasoned troops. The tactical excellence and fanatical commitment of the Japanese soldier, which defined the fierce resistance at Buna and Gona, were ultimately neutralized by the environmental trap. The jungle, initially seen as a defense, became a logistical vacuum that systematically starved and sickened the men, robbing them of the physical capacity to sustain the fight. The Japanese command's inflexible doctrine of no surrender and no retreat ensured that the siege became a total war of extermination, maximizing their casualties and guaranteeing the complete loss of their fighting capacity in the region. The failure was rooted in a profound misreading of Allied capacity. The Japanese command failed to account for the speed and ruthlessness with which the Allies established air superiority and logistical redundancy. The ability of the Australian forces to stabilize their supply line and commit overwhelming firepower, coupled with the systematic air evacuation of the sick and wounded, provided a strategic advantage that the Japanese, reliant on a collapsing human portage network, could not counter. The Japanese offensive was defeated by the supply line of the enemy far more than by their direct combat superiority. The final battles for the beachheads were a brutal confirmation of the strategic verdict. The Australian and American forces were fighting an enemy that was literally starving and sick, yet maintaining an immense, terrifying tactical defense. This grim resilience only served to increase the strategic cost for the Japanese, ensuring that every soldier who survived the mountains perished in the final coastal siege. The legacy of Kokoda is one of total logistical and strategic defeat, a campaign where the sheer physical reality of supply and disease proved to be the unassailable victor. The ultimate enduring legacy of the Kokoda Campaign and the successful defense of Port Moresby is the definitive confirmation of the primacy of the supply line as the victor in the unforgiving environment of the Pacific War. The entire campaign serves as a catastrophic case study in how the strategic goals of an ambitious military power can be entirely undone by the failure to secure and sustain its logistical tail across a hostile, vast geography. The Australian victory was fundamentally a logistical triumph. It was won by the relentless, heroic efforts of the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, the systematic application of air supply drops, and the rapid deployment of advanced medical evacuation capabilities. This logistical resilience ensured that the Australian forces could stabilize their operational capacity and transition from a desperate retreat to a sustained counteroffensive, a feat impossible without the reliable flow of food, ammunition, and medical aid. The stability of the supply line was the ultimate, unassailable weapon that guaranteed the endurance of the Australian defense. The Japanese defeat was a logistical suicide. The collapse of their human portage system, the devastating impact of starvation and disease, and the isolation caused by Allied air and naval superiority proved fatal. Their belief that the jungle would protect them was a profound delusion. The jungle became the ultimate logistical trap, consuming their elite fighting forces and ensuring that their sacrifice was strategically meaningless. The Imperial High Command's failure to plan for a sustained, material-intensive war in the Papuan interior sealed the fate of the South Seas detachment. The enduring lesson for future military doctrine is clear. In the Pacific theater, The terrain and the supply line are the non-negotiable determinants of victory. The individual skill of the soldier and the tactical brilliance of the commanders are secondary to the capacity to sustain the fight indefinitely against a vast, hostile environment. The sheer cost of fighting the Kokoda Campaign, the immense loss of life on both sides, cemented the reality that victory in the Pacific was fundamentally a logistical and industrial contest. The ultimate significance of the campaign is that it saved Australia from isolation and invasion. By securing Port Moresby, the Allies maintained their crucial base of operations in the southern Pacific, ensuring the continuous flow of American aid and the operational capacity for the subsequent counteroffensives against the Japanese Empire. The fighting in the Green Hell was the critical life-or-death moment that ensured the long-term strategic viability of the Allied Pacific strategy. The enduring story of Kokoda is one of sacrifice and strategic necessity, a profound reminder that the war was won not just on the sea, but in the heart of the unforgiving logistical nightmare of the jungle. The logistical failure that doomed the Japanese forces was inextricably linked to the environmental weapon used against both sides: tropical disease, with malaria standing out as the most devastating non-combat casualty. The impact of the pathogens on the operational capacity of the fighting units was immense, transforming the medical support system into a decisive strategic factor, a resource the Japanese completely lacked. The sheer biological hostility of the Papuan jungle proved to be an enemy far more effective and persistent than any infantry company. For the Japanese forces, operating without a functioning supply line, the medical crisis was catastrophic. Their limited medical supplies were quickly exhausted, leaving the sick and wounded with minimal treatment. Units were often rendered combat ineffective not by direct fire, but by the relentless fevers and debilitating effects of tropical pathogens. Malaria, transmitted by the massive populations of mosquitoes in the swampy interior, was endemic. Dysentery and scrub typhus ravaged the ranks, transforming physically fit soldiers into gaunt, exhausted shadows in a matter of days. The Japanese reliance on individual endurance proved fatal when faced with biological warfare. The finest soldier's will was useless against the demands of a high fever and acute dehydration. The strategic consequence of the disease was a profound erosion of manpower. The sheer volume of non-combat casualties meant that units arriving at the front were already significantly under strength, and those fighting were often plagued by recurring illness, limiting their physical capacity for sustained combat. The loss of officers and NCOs to disease was particularly damaging, leading to a collapse of command cohesion and a further breakdown of discipline as the units spiraled into starvation and illness. The jungle was literally consuming the Japanese army from within. The Australian forces, while also severely affected by tropical diseases, with casualty rates from illness often exceeding those from combat, were saved by their superior medical logistics and preventive measures. The Australian command implemented systematic anti-malarial protocols, including the mandatory use of quinine and mepecrine, though often inconsistently applied, and strict discipline regarding mosquito netting. Crucially, their ability to rapidly evacuate the seriously ill via air transport was a life-saving mechanism. A Japanese soldier with severe dysentery was likely doomed to die on the trail. An Australian soldier with the same condition had a high probability of being evacuated, treated, and returned to the fight, or at least removed from the pressure on the forward supply chain. The medical crisis was, therefore, a massive amplifier of the logistical disparity. The Japanese forces were not only starved of food and ammunition, but they were fatally starved of basic medical aid and the capacity to evacuate their sick. The ultimate defeat of the Japanese forces was a biological and logistical certainty, with tropical diseases performing much of the attritional work that Australian bullets could not, confirming that the medical logistics of a campaign in the Green Hell were as decisive as the artillery barrage. The Kokoda Campaign served as the critical test of systems for both the Allied and Japanese forces in the Pacific theater, revealing fundamental flaws and defining the tactical doctrine that would govern the remainder of the war in New Guinea. The unique, brutal environment demanded a complete re-evaluation of command, logistics, and inter-service coordination, lessons that the Allied forces rapidly absorbed, while the Japanese remained fatally locked into rigid, high-risk doctrines. For the Allies, the campaign underscored the absolute necessity of integrated command and inter-service collaboration. The successful stabilization of the supply line, the effective use of airdrops, and the decisive amphibious assault on Walcheren Island, from a previous campaign, confirmed that no single service, infantry, air, or navy, could succeed in isolation. The logistical lifeline across the Owen Stanley Range required the precise coordination of air transport and ground pioneers, creating a joint operational framework that was capable of adapting to the rapidly changing demands of the environment. The Allied system demonstrated an immense capacity for learning and adaptation, quickly discarding failed tactics and embracing new, specialized methods for jungle warfare. The Japanese system, conversely, proved fatally rigid. Their command structure was marred by internal conflicts, poor communication between the field commanders and imperial headquarters, and an unwillingness to deviate from the high-risk doctrine of the initial thrust. The systematic failure to correctly estimate the logistical needs and the refusal to admit strategic defeat early in the campaign led to the continuous consumption of their elite fighting forces. The Japanese system prioritized tactical audacity and individual sacrifice over the cold, hard logic of strategic supply and casualty management. The tactical lessons learned in the Green Hell were profound. The brutal close-quarters fighting demanded highly specialized training for the infantry. The Australian forces quickly adapted to the Japanese infiltration and envelopment tactics by embracing aggressive patrolling, disciplined perimeter defense, and maximizing the use of suppressive fire. The Americans, observing the heavy cost of the Bunagona siege, further refined their own doctrine for jungle warfare, focusing on specialized units, coordinated air-ground attacks, and the absolute necessity of portable, high-volume firepower, such as flamethrowers and satchel charges, to neutralize the formidable coconut log bunkers. The New Guinea campaign, therefore, was a massive, protracted examination of military efficacy in an extreme environment. The Allied forces, though paying a massive initial price, emerged with a superior system, one that prioritized logistical resilience and operational flexibility. The Japanese forces, through their strategic inflexibility and logistical collapse, provided the Allies with the necessary battlefield laboratory to refine the tactics and systems that would ultimately lead to the defeat of the Japanese Empire across the Pacific. The lessons of Kokoda were written in blood, but they provided the necessary blueprint for victory. Attention, forward scouts! You've just seen the ultimate test of systems in the New Guinea crucible, where flexibility and logistics beat rigid doctrine. The lessons learned here defeated the Empire. If the strategic complexity of jungle warfare and the decisive role of medical supply resonate with your mind, do not let the history be lost in the thicket. Subscribe now and commit to preserving the strategic analysis of the Pacific. And here is your tactical assessment. What military adaptation, flamethrowers against bunkers, continuous airdrops, or the use of jungle-trained commandos, do you believe was the most decisive factor in reversing the Japanese momentum? Drop your analysis in the comments below. We rely on your strategic insights. Following the definitive Japanese retreat from Imata Ridge, the Australian forces immediately embarked on the long, difficult road to recapture. The systematic process of driving the weakened enemy back across the Owen Stanley Range toward the north coast. This phase of the campaign was defined by relentless pursuit, high-altitude endurance, and the agonizing reversal of the initial flow of the battle. The Australians were now on the offensive, but the terrain remained the fiercest obstacle. The challenge of the recapture was the relentless intensity of the terrain. The Australian infantry, now fighting uphill and across the same razor-sharp, muddy ridges that had characterized their retreat, faced the constant physical exhaustion of altitude and the continuous downpour of the tropical monsoons. The Japanese forces, though demoralized and starving, maintained their immense tactical skill in fighting a brilliant rearguard action. They utilized the dense jungle foliage, the deep ravines, and the reverse slopes of the mountains to establish ambush positions and temporary strongpoints, forcing the Australian forces into costly, time-consuming clearance operations. The success of the Australian pursuit was rooted in their sustained logistical superiority. The capacity to maintain the flow of supplies and ammunition, coupled with the systematic rotation of units and the continued rapid medical evacuation, ensured that the Australian forces maintained their offensive operational tempo. The Japanese, conversely, were fighting solely on what they could carry, their units disintegrating from starvation, and the inability to replace their continuous losses. The pursuit was a systematic process of attrition, exploiting the enemy's biological and material exhaustion. The battle for the heights involved fierce, localized fighting for key geographical features along the trail, villages, peaks, and critical choke points that determined the speed of the advance. The Australians adopted an aggressive patrolling and infiltration doctrine, utilizing their superior training and local support to bypass fixed Japanese positions and strike deep into the enemy's flanks. The pursuit was a race against the clock, aiming to prevent the Japanese from establishing a cohesive, fortified defense of their northern beachheads before the Australian forces could reach the coastal plain. The arduous road to recapture was a final, grueling test of the Australian soldiers' endurance and the resilience of the Allied logistical system. Every meter gained was a testament to the immense physical cost of overcoming the relentless terrain and the disciplined defense of a defeated but dangerous enemy. The success of the pursuit guaranteed that the final battles on the coastal plain would be fought on favorable terms, ensuring the total annihilation of the Japanese forces in the region and the security of Port Moresby. The extreme environment and high stakes of the Kokoda Campaign placed immense strain on the ethical lines of command and conduct for both sides, revealing a profound contrast in the nature of discipline and the treatment of the sick and prisoners. The campaign, fought to the point of total exhaustion and starvation, became a crucible that exposed the fundamental differences in doctrine between the Allied commitment to medical aid and the Japanese doctrine of no surrender. The immense strain on the Japanese forces, driven to starvation and collapse, led to horrific instances of brutality and disregard for human life, primarily directed at the local Papuan population and, tragically, at their own sick and wounded. Driven by a desperate need for food, isolated Japanese units committed atrocities against local villages, exacerbating the alienation of the Papuan people and solidifying the local support for the Australian forces. Furthermore, the inflexible doctrine of Bushido and the command's commitment to no surrender meant that the seriously sick and wounded were often abandoned to die on the trail, a grim logistical necessity dictated by the collapse of their supply chain. The Japanese ethical line dissolved under the pressure of starvation. The Australian forces, while facing extreme fatigue and immense frustration with the hidden, tenacious enemy, generally maintained a higher ethical standard and commitment to medical aid. The systematic evacuation of casualties via the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels and the air transport system was a moral imperative, prioritizing the life of the individual soldier, even when it placed immense strain on the logistical chain. The compassionate treatment of the sick and the commitment to the Geneva Conventions, even in the brutal environment of the jungle, provided a profound moral contrast to the enemy's actions. The Australian commitment to the individual soldier was a self-sustaining moral force that reinforced discipline and cohesion. The profound difference in the ethical command was most starkly visible in the treatment of the wounded. The Japanese doctrine viewed capture or surrender as the ultimate disgrace, leading to a grim war of extermination where no quarter was asked or given. The Allied forces, observing this brutality and the systematic abandonment of the Japanese sick, were often faced with ethical dilemmas regarding the treatment of a seemingly ruthless enemy. The extreme violence of the close-quarters fighting, particularly in the later siege of Buna and Gona, sometimes blurred the lines of conduct, but the fundamental commitment of the Allied command to the preservation of life and the evacuation of their own sick remained the defining ethical anchor of the campaign. The Kokoda Campaign provided a grim, necessary lesson that the ethical conduct of a military force is often the final casualty of a protracted, brutal war of attrition. The immense pressure placed on the Japanese forces led to a moral collapse, while the Allied commitment to medical support and the individual soldier sustained a moral high ground that, though immensely costly, reinforced the underlying strength and values of their systems. The final price of the Kokoda Campaign was exacted during the brutal, protracted siege of the Bunagona coastal beachheads, a costly war of extermination that confirmed the immense strategic significance of the Australian victory. The cost of taking these final, fortified strongpoints was disproportionately high, demanding the total commitment of the exhausted Australian forces and the newly committed American infantry. The high cost was dictated by the absolute strength of the Japanese fortifications. The coconut log bunkers and massive earthworks, constructed by the Japanese in the short respite provided by their rearguard action, were nearly impenetrable to standard infantry fire and light artillery. The Allied forces were forced into a slow, systematic reduction of the strongpoints, relying on the high-risk, close-quarters application of specialized demolition charges and flamethrowers to breach the defenses one by one. The dense, swampy terrain and the thick jungle foliage provided perfect camouflage for the entrenched Japanese, ensuring that every assault was launched against a hidden, disciplined, and deadly enemy. The losses sustained by the Allied forces in this final siege were immense, compounding the already high casualty rates from the fighting on the trail. The American forces, committed to the direct assault on Buna, suffered catastrophic losses, often due to their inexperience in dealing with the unique strength of the Japanese fortifications and their relentless, suicidal counterattacks. The Australian forces, exhausted by the long pursuit, fought with immense courage, but their ranks were continuously thinned by the sustained, accurate Japanese fire from the entrenched bunkers. The immense cost of the beachheads was a necessary price paid to secure the ultimate strategic objective: the total annihilation of the Japanese forces in the region and the guarantee of Port Moresby's security. The total consumption of the Japanese South Seas Detachment, achieved by the Allied forces, was a strategic victory of immense magnitude, securing the southern flank of the Pacific War and preventing any future attempts to isolate Australia. The battle for the beachheads, though brutal and costly, was the final definitive strategic act of the campaign. The final price paid in the swamps and on the beaches of Buna and Gona was the final tragic testament to the destructive power of a war of attrition in an extreme environment. The sacrifice of the infantry in overcoming the final, formidable barrier confirmed the tactical lessons learned on the trail: the importance of specialized firepower, the necessity of close-quarters demolition, and the absolute requirement for sustained logistical support. The total defeat of the Japanese forces in Papua was sealed in the final, brutal, and costly siege of their coastal fortress. The total annihilation of the Japanese forces at the Bunagona beachheads marked the decisive conclusion of the Kokoda Campaign and secured the entirety of the Allied southern flank in the Pacific theater. This strategic victory, purchased at the immense cost of blood and logistical effort, had immediate and profound consequences for the trajectory of the war against the Japanese Empire, ensuring that the initial strategic objective of isolating Australia would never be successfully revived. The strategic aftermath was defined by the rapid consolidation of Allied power and the irreversible shift in offensive initiative. The primary strategic consequence was the absolute security of Port Moresby. The capture and security of this massive base provided the Allies with the necessary operational hub to launch subsequent offensives across the New Guinea coastline and into the vast Indonesian archipelago. Port Moresby became the essential springboard for the island-hopping campaign led by General Douglas MacArthur, allowing the Allies to project power westward without the continuous threat of an overland thrust from the north. The entire logistical network that had been painfully established along the Kokoda Trail now served as the vital, secure rear area for the final stages of the New Guinea campaign. The defeat also forced a fundamental, irreversible re-evaluation of Japanese strategy. The Imperial High Command realized that the ambitious plan for a synchronized, multi-pronged advance into the southern Pacific was no longer viable. The massive loss of the South Seas Detachment an elite and highly trained fighting force, was an irreplaceable blow to their offensive capability in the region. The Japanese were permanently relegated to a defensive posture, forced to expend immense resources in defending their remaining island fortresses against the inevitable, sustained Allied counteroffensives. The myth of Japanese jungle invincibility, a psychological pillar of their early war success, was irrevocably shattered by the Australian endurance on the trail. The strategic aftermath also saw the acceleration of Allied air superiority and logistical development. The lessons learned in the Scheldt and Kokoda campaigns, the necessity of specialized logistical support, air-ground coordination, and rapid infrastructure development, were immediately applied across the Pacific theater. The Allies invested heavily in building advanced logistical hubs, all-weather airstrips, and specialized amphibious assault teams designed to overcome the unique defensive challenges posed by the Japanese in the jungle and on Coral Islands. The immense, sustained effort required to defeat the Japanese at Kokoda provided the necessary blueprint for the highly technical, resource-intensive campaigns that would follow in the Central and Northern Pacific. The securing of the southern flank was the final, undeniable proof that the Japanese strategic high-water mark had been reached. The immense cost of the Kokoda campaign was the necessary payment for the total security of Australia and the irreversible commencement of the sustained Allied drive toward the Japanese home islands. The mud and the jungle of Papua became the graveyard of the Japanese ambition in the South Pacific. The Kokoda campaign vividly exposed the profound cultural chasm between the Allied and Japanese forces, particularly concerning the concepts of honor, surrender, and the meticulous documentation of human losses. This cultural conflict amplified the tactical brutality of the fighting, and fundamentally shaped the final tragic outcome of the siege battles. The Japanese military doctrine, rooted in the code of Bushido, preached the absolute disgrace of surrender. The soldier was expected to fight until death, making the vast majority of battles, particularly the final siege of Buna and Gona, wars of extermination. This commitment to no surrender, while demonstrating immense personal courage and tenacity, was strategically disastrous. It maximized casualties on both sides and eliminated the possibility of managing losses through prisoner capture. For the Japanese command, it meant that their immense human losses were often undocumented, swallowed by the jungle or the sea, leading to the massive, chilling discrepancy in their official casualty reports. The Allied forces, operating under the moral and ethical framework of the Geneva Conventions, were committed to the capture and medical treatment of enemy combatants. However, the Japanese doctrine often led to brutal, complex situations on the battlefield. Japanese soldiers would feign surrender only to detonate hidden grenades, forcing the Allied troops to operate under perpetual suspicion and extreme caution. This necessity to operate with extreme brutality in close quarters, combat against an enemy who refused to surrender, placed immense psychological strain on the Allied soldiers, who were forced to fight a continuous war of extermination against an often hidden foe. The most tragic consequence of this cultural chasm was the failure of official documentation. The Australian and American forces meticulously documented their losses and accounted for captured Japanese prisoners. The Japanese Imperial Command, conversely, often failed to account for the immense loss of its own men, viewing death in battle as an expected outcome and surrender as a non-existent category. The massive discrepancy between the estimated Japanese losses, over 13,000, and the actual number of documented prisoners confirmed the tragic scope of the logistical and ethical failure. The Japanese forces were consumed by the jungle and the sea, often without official record of their fate, a profound act of disrespect to the immense sacrifice of their own soldiers. The ethical high ground of the Allied forces, their commitment to the systematic evacuation of the wounded, the provision of medical aid, and the adherence to the laws of war, provided a necessary moral counterbalance to the brutality of the conflict. This moral and ethical commitment ensured that the psychological cohesion and discipline of the Allied forces were maintained, reinforcing the underlying strength and values of their systems. The legacy of Kokoda is not just a military victory. It is a profound moral statement about the cost of a war fought without the common ethical acknowledgement of surrender. The successful conclusion of the Kokoda Campaign left behind a challenging, critical engineer's legacy, the necessity of transforming the primitive wartime supply lines into a sustainable, modern infrastructure capable of supporting the massive offensive campaigns that followed. The final victory in Papua was not possible without the immense creative efforts of the Allied Engineer Corps to overcome the unique geographical and environmental obstacles. The immediate engineering challenge was the transformation of the supply route. The narrow, treacherous Kokoda Trail, suitable only for human portage, had to be replaced by reliable all-weather roads and expanded logistical hubs. Allied engineers, often working in the most extreme conditions, began the massive undertaking of cutting new roads through the dense jungle, building temporary bridges over massive ravines, and stabilizing airfields to handle the immense volume of air transport required for the next phase of the war. This focus on rapid, specialized infrastructure development was the critical precondition for the large-scale military operations across the remainder of New Guinea. The second major engineering feat was the creation of reliable forward air bases. The Allied strategy in the Pacific was fundamentally dependent on air superiority, requiring the continuous supply of fuel, ammunition, and maintenance facilities for thousands of aircraft. The Engineer Corps transformed swampy coastal plains and jungle clearings into functioning operational air bases, utilizing specialized materials and drainage techniques to overcome the persistent problem of the tropical rainfall and the soft, unstable ground. The ability to rapidly construct and sustain advanced airfields was the final, non-negotiable logistical weapon that guaranteed the Allied dominance in the region. The engineering legacy also involved a continuous high-risk effort in demining and clearance. The retreating Japanese forces had left behind a massive legacy of booby traps, hidden mines, and unexploded ordnance, particularly in the vicinity of their former strongpoints and defensive lines. The Allied clearance teams, often working alongside the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, faced the continuous, perilous task of neutralizing these hidden weapons, securing the forward areas for troop movements, and the construction of new infrastructure. This painstaking, high-risk work was essential for maintaining the operational tempo and minimizing non-combat casualties. The ultimate, long-term legacy of the engineers' work in Papua was the realization that infrastructure is destiny in the Pacific. The immense difficulty and high cost of fighting the campaign confirmed that victory was not about seizing ground, but about the capacity to build and sustain the logistical structure necessary to leverage industrial power. The lessons learned in New Guinea, the necessity of portable construction materials, specialized drainage, and the continuous support of air transport, became the strategic template for the entire island-hopping campaign, ensuring that the Allies would never again allow the Japanese to exploit the hostile terrain to the detriment of the supply line. The immense human cost of the Kokoda Campaign solidified the enduring legacy of the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, the Papuan carriers whose courage and compassion became the defining symbol of human cooperation and resilience in the face of military necessity. Their role, initially one of pure logistical labor, transitioned into a profound moral and cultural force that anchored the Australian memory of the conflict. The voice of remembrance for the campaign is inextricably linked to their silent, heroic service. The carriers' ultimate legacy is rooted in the sheer humanitarian nature of their service. They risked their lives daily, carrying supplies forward into the chaos of the front line, and, most famously, carrying the severely wounded and sick Australian soldiers back to safety. Their refusal to abandon the injured, their gentle treatment of the suffering troops, and their commitment to endure immense physical duress cemented an unbreakable bond of gratitude and respect. This unique cultural exchange, born in the brutal environment of the jungle, provided the Allied soldiers with a vital moral anchor, a testament to the essential goodness of humanity amidst the profound violence of total war. The Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels were the unwavering logistical backbone of the campaign, performing a task that was entirely non-negotiable for the Australian operational capacity. Their intimate knowledge of the treacherous terrain and their ability to move supplies and casualties efficiently were the single most critical factor that prevented the collapse of the Australian supply line during the most desperate phase of the retreat. Their loyalty and their labor were the human currency that ensured the stabilization of the entire southern flank. The post-war legacy of the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels became a source of national reflection and pride for Australia, recognizing that their survival and eventual victory were fundamentally dependent on the assistance of the Papuan people. The subsequent decades saw efforts to officially recognize their contribution, ensuring that their immense, selfless service was formally recorded and honored. Their story became a profound symbol of the ethical dimension of the conflict, a reminder that the war in the Pacific was fought not just against the enemy, but for the fundamental values of human dignity and cooperation. The enduring image of the campaign remains the carrier, exhausted but resolute, bearing the wounded soldier across the mud and the mire of the trail. This image is the final, powerful symbol of endurance, compassion, and the strategic importance of the human logistical thread. The voice of remembrance for Kokoda is forever linked to the silent, heroic passage of the Papuan carriers, whose immense contribution ensured that the human cost of the campaign, though vast, was not utterly overwhelming. Their legacy is a final, beautiful affirmation of humanity's capacity for kindness, even in the heart of the Green Hell. The successful conclusion of the Kokoda Campaign and the subsequent securing of the Southern Pacific delivered the ultimate strategic verdict on the entire operation. The Japanese forces were defeated not by a single tactical failure, but by the sprung logistical trap of the environment, a verdict that redefined the parameters of the Pacific War. The campaign confirmed that the jungle, which the Japanese believed to be their shield, was ultimately transformed into a total consuming prison by the superior logistics and industrial capacity of the Allied powers. The core verdict was the primacy of environmental logistics. The failure of the Japanese to secure a stable supply chain, coupled with the biological hostility of the jungle, created an irreversible attrition rate that consumed their manpower through disease and starvation. Their high-risk doctrine of the overland thrust was a fatal miscalculation of the Papuan interior's capacity to absorb and destroy a traditional supply system. The Australian defence, sustained by air power, local support, and superior medical logistics, successfully weathered the storm and transformed the trail into the strategic killing zone. The second verdict was the supremacy of system over individual sacrifice. The immense courage and fanatical defense of the Japanese soldiers, particularly in the siege of Buna and Gona, were neutralized by the Allied capacity to systematically replace losses, evacuate the sick, and apply overwhelming firepower through a stable logistical funnel. The immense individual sacrifice of the Japanese was strategically meaningless against the sustained, industrialized resilience of the Allied operational framework. The Allied system demonstrated that the war in the Pacific would be won by logistics and material resources, not by tactical audacity alone. The third verdict was the total strategic cost of inflexibility. The Japanese command's failure to adapt their doctrine, their refusal to acknowledge the strategic defeat until the point of total collapse, and their commitment to the doctrine of no surrender ensured that the campaign was fought to the point of maximum, unnecessary human cost. The eventual total annihilation of their forces in Papua was the grim, final payment for the strategic misjudgment in Tokyo. The final legacy of Kokoda is that it provided the irrevocable strategic template for the Allied victory in the Pacific. The lessons learned, the necessity of specialized logistical support, the ethical imperative of casualty management, and the tactical requirement for overwhelming, synchronized firepower became the non-negotiable blueprint for the subsequent island-hopping campaigns. The jungle, once an unknown, terrifying obstacle, was mapped, understood, and ultimately conquered by the superior logistics and endurance of the Allied forces. The defeat of the Japanese forces in Papua was a strategic certainty, confirmed by the total consumption of their fighting men, by the unforgiving logistical trap of the Green Hell.